We need pipelines. It's the most efficient, environmentally friendly, and safe way to transport petroleum. Right now, we are landlocked. We have to send 99% of our oil to the United States of America, and that means they lowball us on price. They make all the profit. We just hand them a resource, and they turn it into money for themselves. If we had more pipelines, we could deliver our oil to international markets without going through the Americans, and we could do it in a manner that's most environmentally responsible, lowest emitting upstream production of any country on earth. So that all takes pipelines.
I'm Peter McCully. That's Pierre Poilievre, leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. Poilievre was in British Columbia recently and sat down for a one-on-one interview with reporter Michael Bramadat-Willcock at the Terrace Standard. We'll talk to Michael about that interview when Today in BC continues.
Hey, it's the Moj, Bob Marjanovic. Join me on the Moj on Sports podcast on Black Press Media at todayinbc.com. Listen into conversations with well-known athletes and celebrities as we look behind the scenes at these successful people. Listen in to the Moj on Sports podcast on todayinbc.com. You'll also find the Moj on Sports podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, YouTube, and Google Podcasts, as well as mojonsports.com.
Thanks for joining us today, Michael.
Thanks so much for having me, Peter.
Pierre Poilievre has not held many press conferences since being elected leader of the Conservative Party of Canada and the leader of the official opposition. So it was really great that you could get to talk to him one-on-one. What was the occasion for Poilievre to be in Terrace?
Poilievre had just come back from a tour of the liquefied natural gas terminal in Kitimat, accompanied by MLA for Skeena Alice Ross and Prince George Peace River Northern Rockies MP Bob Zimmer. The terminal in Kitimat is where the Coastal GasLink pipeline finishes its route from northeast BC to the ocean. He also stopped in Prince Rupert before passing through Terrace. We were lucky enough to catch up with him in Terrace, and we spoke for about half an hour.
Michael, before we talk about the actual interview and your discussions with Pierre Poilievre, perhaps you could give us some background on how Poilievre got where he is.
So he's been around for a while. He's been doing politics since he was just 16, at least. When he was 16, he sold Reform Party memberships and did outreach for Jason Kenney, who was most recently Premier of Alberta. The Reform Party is further to the right, for those who don't know, Conservative Party that no longer exists, but at the time it was a player in politics. And so when he was 17 years old, Poilievre was a delegate to the Reform Party 1996 National Convention in Vancouver. And this was all prior to when he became leader of the Conservative Party just recently in a pretty decisive victory. Poilievre has been an MP since 2004. At first for the Ottawa area riding of Nepean-Carleton. That's now called just Carleton since it was reestablished. So he's been in Ottawa at least since 2004 as an MP. He was Minister of Democratic Reform from 2013 to 2015. And then he was Minister of Employment and Social Development in 2015. He has a bachelor's degree in international relations from the University of Calgary. And going back to his start, he worked as an advisor for Canadian Alliance leader Stockwell Day. He went from being very active in the Reform Party and the Progressive Conservative Association of Alberta, and then went along with Stephen Harper's reconciliation between the Reform Party and the Conservative Party that merged into what is now the Conservative Party that we know today.
You mentioned Poilievre is originally from Calgary. I'm going to assume right up front that in your interview he had something significant to say about the oil and gas industry.
Yeah, and I talked to him a little bit about LNG, which is liquefied natural gas, and oil pipelines, about whether he would speed up and fast track the process for projects like these, particularly liquefied natural gas. And that was as well his premise for being here. He was touring those kinds of facilities with MLA Alice Ross, and he had a focus on First Nations development of LNG natural resource projects.
Yes, I think when Trudeau took office, there were about 15 of these LNG projects proposed. Not a single one is complete 7 years later. The only one that has progressed is LNG Canada, and that's because it was approved under the earlier government. I would fast-track approval for projects like this. so that we can supply Asia with clean Canadian natural gas that is liquefied using the lowest emitting and highest environmental standards possible. And we could end poverty in many of these communities if we had the liquefaction facilities to bring this resource to market. It would also increase demand for Canadian natural gas. So there are communities right across Western Canada that indirectly benefit by having a new export terminal to ship their goods through. So yeah, I would speed up these projects in particular in ways that allow First Nations to benefit as co-owners, as employees, and as the principal beneficiaries. We need pipelines. It's the most efficient, environmentally friendly, and safe way to transport petroleum. Right now, we are landlocked. We have to send 99% of our oil to the United States of America, and that means they lowball us on price. They make all the profit. We just hand them a resource, and they turn it into money for themselves. If we had more pipelines, we could deliver our oil to international markets without going through the Americans, and we could do it in a manner that's most environmentally responsible, lowest emitting upstream production of any country on earth. So that all takes pipelines.
So, Peter, I also had a chance to follow up with Mr. Poilievre about the approval process and how he might change that.
We need a law that requires the company consult First Nations, protect the environment, but that gives a decision in a reasonable time frame based on the scientific facts, not based on politics. And that's the major change I would make, to consider pipelines, natural gas projects, or mining in general. First of all, they're being made very slowly. It takes 7-8 years to get a project decision from Ottawa. There's duplication between levels of government, and ministers are interfering in decisions rather than allowing the science and the environmental reviews to determine the outcome. So I think the Tech Frontier mine in northern Alberta was a $20 billion project. I think it was supported by all the First Nations around it, and Trudeau effectively killed it, even though the project passed all of the environmental hurdles. That's $20 billion of opportunity gone and nothing to show for it. The second thing is we need to make the system predictable. The Bill C-69 included all these woke provisions that you want proponents to write up an analysis on the gender impacts of a project. Projects are gender neutral by nature. Anybody can work on them. There are men and women who equally work on them. And so this requirement just creates uncertainty. Businesses don't want to invest because they don't know what exactly it is they're being tested on. They're not going to tie up $10 billion of capital for a process that they can't make sense of. So I would make the criteria simple and clear, protect the First Nations, protect the environment, get a clear decision. Those would be the principles that would guide my energy laws.
Michael, I know the high cost of fertilizer for farmers has been getting a lot of attention these days, a lot of play in the rural areas. What did, if anything, Poilievre have to say about that?
The fertilizer tariff issue has been big in rural BC, and I was able to ask Poilievre his position on that.
We need to get rid of the fertilizer tariff that's driving up the costs and get rid of the carbon tax on fertilizers, because that's further making it expensive. The federal government has this vague objective of cutting fertilizer use by 30% by 2030. This is a staggering goal, and what ironically could end up being very bad for the environment, because it will reduce output per acre. And that means you'll need a bigger footprint to produce the same amount of food, which means burning more fuel to run the tractors and combines longer distances. And ultimately will drive up costs so much that we'd end up having to bring more of our food from abroad, which has to be shipped, trained, and trucked, burning fuel. So ironically, you'd push production out of our country to more polluting foreign jurisdictions, and that would be bad for everything. So I want to bring more food production home to Canada. We have, I think, the 5th or 6th most agricultural land per capita on earth. We should not only be able to feed ourselves affordably, but feed the world, and that takes fertilizer.
When Poilievre ran for the leadership of the Progressive Conservatives, he was elected on the first ballot. That's the first time that's happened in 20 years.
Yes, and I asked him about what he thinks is attractive to potential voters and Conservative Party members in terms of their policies and positions.
We've had massive increase in our membership. We now have 675,000 members, which makes us the biggest political party in Canadian history. I think people like our direction of removing the gatekeepers, combating inflation, and canceling Trudeau and Singh's plan to triple the carbon tax. These policies are popular, and they're attracting more and more Canadians. And we have 40-year high inflation. Food prices are rising at faster than any time in my life. 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals because they can't afford food. 35-year-olds are living in their parents' basements because they can't afford houses. We can't get children's medicine in our pharmacies, even though they're available in the United States. Violent crimes up 32%. Things are going very badly in this country right now. People are looking for a change, some common sense. So I'm going to stop the money printing, control government spending in Ottawa, and cancel the tripling of the carbon tax. I'm also going to remove the gatekeepers so that we can produce more energy, food, and houses here. In other words, stop creating cash, start creating more of what cash buys. And on crime, I'm going to target the most violent repeat offenders, put them behind bars so that we can protect our communities, reverse this government policy of flooding the streets with cheap heroin and other drugs that are killing our people, instead put the money into treatment and recovery. And I'm going to bolster the borders to keep the illegal guns and drugs out of our country. And these are the policies that have attracted people to our party and that will win us the next election.
When Today in BC continues, reporter Michael Bramadat-Willcock asks Pierre Poilievre to outline his policies on reconciliation and crime.
Why spend hours searching dealerships, comparing makes and models? Find the best of BC's inventory in one place, todaysdrive.com. You'll have access to inventory across BC, where you can easily find a vehicle that fits your needs and gets you where you need to go in comfort. Get in the driver's seat. Don't miss out on the many options we have available for you. Powered by Black Press Media, todaysdrive.com connects you with exclusive new and used car deals.
Today in BC is a Black Press Media podcast. I'm Peter McCully with Terrace Standard reporter Michael Bramadat-Willcock, who recently had a one-on-one interview with the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, Pierre Poilievre. Michael, reconciliation is a very active topic of debate these days.
Yes, it is, Peter. I had a very simple question for Mr. Poilievre, which was, if you were Prime Minister, what would be your approach to reconciliation? And he had this to say.
I believe in a bottom-up approach to reconciliation. We need to give First Nations more control over their land, money, and decision-making. We need to get clearer paths to allow First Nations communities to escape from the Indian Act where they so choose, and to sign treaties, and to allow First Nations to opt for the First Nations Financial Management Act and the First Nations Land Management Act, which allows them to opt out of the Indian Act provisions on land and finances. These are all tools that will allow more local autonomy and less control from Ottawa. The problem is that for hundreds of years, the paternalistic top-down approach of the federal government trying to decide for First Nations has left them with poverty and powerlessness. What we need is to empower First Nations to take control of their own lives with as little interference from the government in Ottawa as possible. And that's what I would do. My goal is really to give local communities, band councils, and their people more autonomy and control where they so choose, and then have less control by the Department of Indigenous Affairs in Ottawa. We've been talking a lot about giving First Nations back control of their financial and governance decisions, giving more autonomy and less Ottawa control over the lives of First Nations and their communities. We've also been talking about removing government gatekeepers to build more natural resource projects that will supply jobs, revenues, social services, and economic independence in First Nations and other communities.
Michael, tell me about Poilievre's approach for crime and the ongoing drug crisis.
The city of Terrace, where I am, has been very vocal about repeat offenders and the opioid crisis. And so I asked him about which approach he would take to that.
Everybody agrees. If a young person makes a mistake and they want to start over, they should get a second chance. We should invest in rehabilitation. But right now, the system is allowing repeat multiple violent offenders to just reoffend over and over again and be released. So the Union of Vancouver Mayors wrote an incredible letter recently in which they recounted the number of arrests for a very small number of offenders. So in Vancouver, there are 40 offenders who've been arrested collectively 6,000 times. 40 offenders, 6,000 arrests. That's 150 arrests per offender. There's two things. For multiple repeat prolific offenders, we need longer jail time. We also need tougher bail conditions. We need bail reform, to keep prolific offenders behind bars, and tougher sentences for those who have built up a long rap sheet of convictions. The Liberal NDP woke agenda of giving people free taxpayer-funded drugs and urging them to live on the streets and continue using those drugs has led to a 300% increase in overdose deaths. The Liberals and NDP, they call this the safe supply. There is no safe supply of poison, and we know that now because the data shows it. It has been a catastrophe. We're on track for 2,000 overdose deaths again this year, which will be another record. So what's the solution? To give them detox, give them a bed, give them a regimen that goes 60 to 90 days, give them counseling to address the underlying reasons that they have the addiction in the first place, and then integrate them into a job after that 60 to 90 day period. It won't work 100% of the time, but this approach is going in Alberta, and they've reduced overdoses by 50% in a single year.
So I understand from your interview that Poilievre says there are federal tax hikes coming in the new year.
So he's talking about EI premiums going up in 2023. I received a press release about carbon tax increases and federal tax hikes, as he called them, but they were not in any detail in the release that I got. Poilievre offered some background and explained that. Here's what he had to say about that.
The big one coming is that EI premiums are going to go up on January 1st. And this is not to fund EI, it's to create a surplus in the EI account that the government will raid and use for other spending. So it'll mean you'll get smaller paychecks, and employers will pay more for every employee they have, and that punishes work. So I would freeze EI premiums so that people could keep more of their paychecks. So those are two examples. The third example is the inflation tax. When inflation goes high, it means that people have to pay more for the same stuff, which means the government gets more sales tax revenue. It means that companies and employees get more nominal income. That's not real income, it's nominal income, and they pay higher tax on that income, even though it doesn't buy as much as their previous income did. I can't affect provincial tax policy, but what I can do is stop the federal government from forcing BC to triple the carbon tax, and that's what's happening now. Jagmeet Singh and Justin Trudeau have voted to impose a 200% increase in the carbon tax in every province in Canada. That's a federal mandate. I would cancel that. Now, I can't force the province to get rid of its existing carbon tax, but at least I can prevent the feds from forcing it to go higher.
There's lots being said about the ongoing inquiry in Ottawa right now into the use of the Emergencies Act. Did you raise the issue with the Conservative Party leader?
Yes, it is, Peter, and I asked Poilievre about that, and he had some animated responses for us.
We've seen no evidence that the government required the Emergencies Act. The blockades at Coutts and Windsor were cleared before the Emergencies Act ever came into place. I think that if the Prime Minister had just sat down with a few of the leaders from the trucker protest, he probably could have put an end to it early on. The whole thing was completely unnecessary. When they brought in the vaccine mandates on truckers, the rest of the world was starting to lift mandates. And so my view is the Prime Minister never should have instigated the protest. First of all, he hit the truckers with the mandate, which was unnecessary. By the way, when his chief public health officer, Teresa Tam, was asked what was the science behind that particular mandate, she had no science, no evidence to support any public safety benefit. Without that, there would have been no protest in the first place. Then, as the thing went on, his only solution was to invoke a never-before-used power to suspend the constitutional rights of Canadians and seize bank accounts. We can't seem to find a single law enforcement body that said that the Emergencies Act was necessary. You'd think that if it were necessary, you'd have the Mounties and the OPP and the Ottawa Police all chomping at the bit to say so in the hearings. We haven't had a single one of them say that. Some of the hysteria and the allegations that the government made about the truckers have now been disproven by testimony, including by governmental officials and law enforcement personnel. My view is that you can simultaneously support the truckers who are protesting for their livelihoods and liberties while holding individually responsible anyone who broke laws, behaved badly, or blocked critical infrastructure. And that's the line that I would draw.
And how would you deal with protests that are happening to do with the pipeline here? For example, the hereditary chiefs in the Wet'suwet'en.
Everybody is entitled to protest. I don't agree with anti-pipeline protests, but I believe they have the right to hold them. They don't have the right to block people from going to work, but they have the right to hold protests and wave placards and shout slogans and give speeches and post on the internet. All of that is a democratic right that should be honored and upheld, as long as they respect the freedoms of everyone else to go to work and proceed with projects that are approved by the authorities.
I'd like to thank Terrace Standard reporter Michael Bramadat-Willcock for being with us on this edition of Today in BC. If you have suggestions or comments, send us a voice message to podcast@blackpress.ca. You may be part of our podcast mailbag segment. You'll find Today in BC podcasts on iTunes, Spotify, Amazon, iHeart, and Google Podcasts.